Good evening, Presbyterian women and men. I am Martha Poole, moderator of Presbyterian Women in the Presbytery of Scioto Valley. At the end of February, I heard a brief report from Rick Nutt upon his return from Palestine and wanted to hear more. I also wanted Presbyterian women to hear from these speakers, but did not want to wait until August or October when we have our summer and fall gatherings to hear what they experienced. So with the support of the coordinating team, I pulled together tonight's speakers and invited them to present a program for us sooner rather than later. Included with the Zoom link were several documents the speakers prepared, including their bios, that you might find helpful to reference during tonight's presentation. Thank you in advance, Hunter, Rick, and Mary Jean. Let us begin with prayer. God of justice and compassion, we cry out to you on behalf of the people seriously affected by the conflict in Gaza and Israel. Our hearts break at the devastation and suffering that we see, and we know it breaks yours too. We ask that you would stretch out your mighty hand to bring an end to this war. We pray for those in positions of power, influence, and leadership. May you guide them in the paths of peace. We cry out for people who have been injured or traumatized, who have lost loved ones or their homes. Please provide everything they need and be their comfort, their hope, their healer, and their safe refuge. We pray for your peace to reign. We look to you as our Savior and the hope of the world. And lastly, I pray that the experiences that Mary Jean, Rick, and Hunter share tonight would lead us to compassionate action, however small or large you would put on our hearts. Amen. I now turn the screen over to begin tonight's presentation. I hand it over to Rick.
We're going to begin this evening with a kind of a historical introduction. I think that you have received ahead of time a timeline from the United Nations. And if you've had a chance to look at that, you'll realize how very selective is the material that I'll be presenting, but we'll proceed. What you see before you is a quotation from David Ben-Gurion, who was the first prime minister of Israel. And it says, "Let us not ignore the truth among ourselves. Politically, we are the aggressors and they defend themselves. The country is theirs because they inhabit it, whereas we want to come here and settle down. And in their view, we want to take away from them their country." I want to put this quotation and the state of Israel in a larger historical context, beginning with what is called the doctrine of discovery. Pope Nicholas V first stated the doctrine of discovery in 1452 for Portugal's colonial efforts in West Africa, and then there were subsequent reaffirmations, especially as Portugal and Spain colonized the Americas. The doctrine granted to colonial powers complete control and autonomy in any lands they entered or, as they said, discovered, which were without a Christian population. As non-Christians, or pagans or heathens, they would have said, the indigenous people could not claim ownership of the land and had no human or civil rights, which the Europeans had to honor. Indeed, the people could be subjugated or enslaved at will. The land was declared to be terra nullius, roughly translated as empty land. The Europeans could claim it as their own, seize it, and move the indigenous people off the land. The process of implementing the doctrine of discovery has come to be called settler colonialism, a specific understanding of colonialism that has emerged in the last 2 or 3 decades. Settler colonialism exists when colonizers move to a new land and begin to dispossess the indigenous people living there. The colonizers claim the land as their own, usually saying that they can do so because the indigenous people have not developed the land at all, and they begin to push the locals off the land. Since the land is undeveloped and the people are labeled as uncivilized, the concept of terra nullius, or empty land, comes into play as justification for stealing the land. The indigenous people must be removed in some way, either through violence or coercion or persuasion. The attempt to eliminate one group of people from land so that another can have it unimpeded is what we mean by ethnic cleansing. Settler colonialism always requires ethnic cleansing. And I would argue that the state of Israel is practicing ethnic cleansing. Let's look at the state of Israel. In mid-19th century, the British wanted to rid England of Jews. And so there was a proposal to have Jews emigrate to Palestine to farm and then send the produce to England, which is, of course, a classic colonial idea. Not long after that, at the end of the 19th century, Theodor Herzl began the Zionist movement among European Jews. The group was responding to the centuries of persecution against Jews by Christians in Europe, and especially the horrible pogroms of the 19th century in Eastern Europe and Russia. The aspiration of Zionists eventually became for Jewish people to move to Palestine and live there. Prior to World War I, Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire, which was centered in modern-day Turkey. That empire threw in their lot with Germany in World War I, and at war's end, Palestine came under the control of Great Britain, what was called the British Mandate. A key event under the Mandate was a 1917 letter, a 1917 letter written by the United Kingdom's Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour, to leaders of the Zionist movement in England and Ireland. Known as the Balfour Declaration, the letter promised British support for a, quote, national home for Jewish people in Palestine. Just what national home meant was unclear because the letter also asserted that there should be no diminution of the civil or religious rights of the indigenous Palestinians already living there. The mandate prompted a significant influx of Jewish people into Palestine in the 1920s and 30s, led by Zionists who argued that Palestine would become, quote, a land without people for a people without a land. Of course, Palestine was not a land without people, and friction and sometimes violence marked the relationship of the Zionist immigrants to the indigenous Palestinians. Whereas Jews, Muslims, and Christians in Palestine had historically coexisted amicably most of the time, not always, of course. Zionists developed strong military groups which periodically attacked both the British and Palestinians. That the British broke their promises to the Palestinians for protection of their rights and even a possible Palestinian state did not help relations all around. Then came World War II with the Holocaust. At war's end, sympathy for surviving Jews led to a massive influx of refugees into Palestine. The situation in Palestine deteriorated in 1947-48, and the British decided to cut their losses and withdraw, announcing that they would do so on May 15th, 1948. They were just turning the situation over to the United Nations which proposed a division of land between Israel and Palestinians. On that day, May the 15th, David Ben-Gurion announced the creation of the State of Israel. The U.S. was the first nation to recognize the new State of Israel. This slide shows the progression of land loss to Palestinians. The first segment shows the land of Palestine in green, with Israeli settlements, or at that time more kibbutzes, in white prior to 1947. The next map shows the proposed United Nations partition in 1948. You can see that Israel was given a significant amount of land in the proposed partition. The yellow dot in the middle is Jerusalem, which was to remain under international control. The next map shows Israel with the West Bank and Gaza following the creation of the State of Israel. And finally, you can see how Israel has consistently seized Palestinian land since the War of 1967 and the occupation that follows. Let's look at some of the historical steps that are reflected on these maps. In the first days and weeks after May 15th of 1948, Israel instituted an already existing plan for the takeover of Palestine. Approximately 450 Palestinian villages were destroyed or emptied of their residents. One famous and notorious example, which actually took place in April of 1948, is the massacre of about 150 people in the village of Deir Yassin, a few miles outside of Jerusalem. Over 750,000 Palestinians, both Muslim and Christian, were made refugees, and many of those who are still in Palestine live in refugee camps to this day, into the third and fourth generation. Palestinians call this the Nakba, or catastrophe. This was the first stage of ethnic cleansing. Of course, war with surrounding Arab states resulted. The end of the fighting left Israel in control of West Jerusalem and most of the western half of Palestine. The land east to the Jordan River came under Jordanian control. In the third map, that's the green section you see there. In 1967, war again broke out between Israel and the surrounding Arab states. This time, Israel ended with controlling all of the West Bank, from Galilee in the north to Gaza in the south and west of the Jordan River. They also controlled the Golan Heights in the far north and the Sinai Peninsula. When Israel refused to withdraw from this seized territory, the United Nations declared their occupation illegal, a United Nations resolution still in effect today. Since 1967, Israel has engaged in a systematic program of land seizures. It's beyond our scope here, but they have used different means to argue that people do not own land on which their families have lived for hundreds or even thousands of years, or have forfeited their claim. As land is seized in strategic locations, Israeli settlements, really very modern cities, as you can see on this slide, are built on land outside of Israel on Palestinian land. Israel also diverts water from Palestinian land, restricts electricity and water service to Palestinian cities and villages, and hampers the economy of Palestinians with its policies. The most extreme example of these policies was in Gaza, where since 2007, Israel has imposed a blockade of any commerce to or from the region and allows almost no travel into or out of Gaza by Palestinians. No wonder that many call Gaza the largest open-air prison in the world. And that was prior to October 7th last year. In short, Israel has imposed policies that are designed to remove the Palestinians, indigenous to the land since before the time of Jesus, from their land. Sometimes violence has been used. Sometimes the people have been coerced by imprisonment or some denial of rights. Sometimes it has been a kind of persuasion by policies designed to make life so hard or unbearable that people choose to leave, as many have done. That is the epitome of settler colonialism and ethnic cleansing. I want to finish this time by moving to a different topic for just a moment. Christian Zionism. Christian Zionism is a term to describe the belief in Christianity that equates ancient or biblical Jews with the Israeli state today. We need to confess that this is the pond most of us swam in growing up in the church. It is not the understanding of our denomination today. There are two primary forms of Christian Zionism. One form derives from a particular Christian view of the end of time. These Christians hold that Jesus will only return and begin his rule over all creation and lead all people to proclaim him Lord and Savior when all Jews return to live in Palestine, their historic home. These Christian Zionists argue that since God gave the land of Palestine to Jews forever and without condition, I would argue that that's not the case, but that's the argument. And since Israel is a Jewish state, Christians should give Israel their full support so that the end of time will arrive as soon as possible. Israel leans on these people for support, especially in the U.S., although ultimately Christian Zionists anticipate the end of Judaism, because all people, in their view, must confess the name of Jesus. Again, this is not a Presbyterian view, and our denomination has renounced it. A second form of Christian Zionism is a reaction against the anti-Jewish persecution and attitudes of Christianity through the centuries, including the traditional evangelistic view that Jewish people need to be converted to Christianity. The very history that Jewish people have endured has led some to support Israel despite the injustice that their occupation of Palestine has perpetrated. I'm sorry, I just got to, okay. What I would like to pause for a moment and see is we kind of wondered how you reacted to this this historical portion. We suspect that it's kind of new material for many of you, or at least some of it is new, and so what we'd like to do is pause for a moment and let you participate for a bit. I want to invite you to go into the, can we do that, Hunter?
We don't have the polling feature on this Zoom, Rick.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
But I was going to just go to the chat section. Great. Okay, good. I wanted to invite you to participate by clicking on your chat icon, which is at the bottom of the screen. You probably know that. I don't mean to tell you things you don't know, but just in case, there's a chat feature at the bottom of the screen. Click on that. And if you could just take a few seconds to type in on the chat one thing that was a new learning for you, or maybe something that surprised you in what I was saying about the history. So we'll just take a little bit of time and do that, and then we'll have a look at some of those. One person was surprised by the maps. Another was surprised to see how quickly the green area became a settlement. Those settlements are really, we think, I don't know, I always thought of a settlement as kind of like an outdoor kinds of structures, you know, but these are cities that the Israelis really create. And refugee camps have become cities as well. We don't, Mary Jean, I think, may have a picture of a refugee. Someone was interested to learn about the British involvement. Yes. Oh, Hunter, that's Hunter's comment, dispensationalism. I didn't throw that word in, but there's a whole movement called dispensational eschatology, and it's tons of fun. Oh, you learned these facts at Presbyterian Women meeting several years ago. That's great. I did not understand Christian Zionist's position on the end of time and its relationship to the Jewish people returning to Palestine. Your comment that Palestinians have lived there before Jesus. That's an interesting issue. I think we I think don't think of Palestinians as people who have always been there, but there were people on the land before the Exodus, right? We know that the Israelites had to deal with people who were already there, and the people still there are descendants of those folks. I don't want to take up too much time. You can cruise through those things on the chat at your leisure, but let me stop that now and turn it over to Mary Jean, who's going to talk about our experience in February. And I will mute myself.
Thanks, Rick, for putting all of this in context. In February, the three of us, along with 32 others, participated in a PCUSA-led Solidarity with the Suffering delegation. The participants all had experience in the Middle East, at least enough to know that our knowledge of the area barely scratched the surface. We were there to learn, but we were also there to stand in solidarity with our faith siblings at a very tense and sobering time. Often the presence of international guests provides a measure of security. For most of the places we visited, we were the very first international guests they had welcomed since October the 7th. Except for a brief visit to Tel Aviv to speak with a hostage family, our delegation was in the West Bank. The West Bank is one of the 3 Palestinian territories illegally occupied by the State of Israel. It's that kidney-shaped area on the map that sits on the West Bank of the Jordan River. To the southwest is Gaza, and in the north is the Golan Heights. Jerusalem is divided into East and West, with East Jerusalem in the West Bank. Bethlehem is south of Jerusalem, with the Ida refugee camp nearby. Ramallah is north of Jerusalem, and north of Ramallah is the Balata refugee camp outside of Nablus. Our visit was intense and comprehensive. Let me just quickly illustrate how exhaustingly inclusive it was. We met with the former Grand Mufti of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and a number of active imams, the Latin Auxiliary Bishop of Jerusalem, the Bishop of the Lutheran Church of Jordan and the Holy Land, the General Secretary of the World Council of Churches, leaders in the Anglican Church, the Mayor of Bethlehem, with whom we held a joint press conference, the 10 human rights groups and NGOs, college and university presidents and scholars, the Israeli Commission Against House Demolition, the Tent of Nations, a forum that has gained international attention, 6 Palestinian civil society organizations, the UNRWA Field Office, the UN Refugee Relief Organization for Palestinians, the U.S. Embassy, hostage families and families of imprisoned Palestinians, and Seville, the Ecumenical Liberation Theology Center, and they served as our host on this visit. It was a bit overwhelming, and in thinking about how I might organize our time together, sharing what we saw and heard, I've divided it into 3 segments: scenes of destruction, systems of occupation, and signs of hope. I'll also report on the most recent Presbyterian peacemakers we have hosted in our presbytery. When we think about destruction in the area, our minds move to the devastating damage in Gaza: homes, hospitals, universities, schools, businesses, a whole region in rubble with tens of thousands dead and even more wounded. It is more than one can get one's mind around. However, the scenes of destruction that I want to share with you this evening are from the West Bank. While the eyes of the world are fixed on Gaza, the state of Israel is intentionally and steadily pilfering land from Palestinians in the West Bank in an attempt to drive Palestinians from the land. We were told that Gaza is of little interest to the state of Israel. It is the ownership of the West Bank that is the jewel in the crown for the state. Since 1947, 173,000 Palestinian homes have been demolished. We witnessed this destruction firsthand. We looked out over the Palestinian neighborhood of Silwan in East Jerusalem, which is pictured here, where homes are being demolished for the flimsiest of reasons. Sometimes the state says that homes don't have proper permits, even though Palestinians can wait for years for permits that are more often than not denied. Sometimes the state claims military interests. The truth is, this is just another means of ethnic cleansing. Now, if you look closely, you can see wide-opened eyes painted on many of the homes. A group of artists painted the murals. Many are recognizable eyes, such as George Floyd, to proclaim that the state of Israel, to proclaim to the state of Israel that the eyes of the world are watching. I'm proud that the PCUSA, through the Israel-Palestine Mission Network, has donated to this art. The man looking up is Fakhri Abu Diab, a member of the Silwan neighborhood. We stood in the courtyard of his destroyed home just 3 days after the bulldozers came and reduced it to rubble. Why? It was retribution for his work as a community organizer against demolitions. 9 of his family members live in that home, filled with possessions and memories of a lifetime. He'll now be responsible for paying for both the demolition and the removal of the mounds of debris. He was too distraught, really, to be with us for more than a few minutes, but his story will stay with us for a lifetime. And most of us brought home a part of the rubble of his home as a reminder. Especially poignant for me is the grassy area pictured. It was a Palestinian children's cemetery that was confiscated and is being overgrown so that the graves will soon disappear. Finally, the bottom 2 pictures are from the Armenian quarter of the old city. Their large parking lot was improperly sold to an Israeli developer who plans to build a high-rise. Armenian young people are occupying the area, sleeping in tents in a crudely built structure, resisting the taking of the land of the oldest Christian presence in the old city. For the present, the bulldozers are paused as the case is still in court. As we were traveling along the road, we witnessed an active demolition of a Palestinian farm to make room for the separation wall being built by the state of Israel. We decided to return to that site to stand in solidarity with the farmer as his olive trees were being ripped out of the ground. We sang songs of protest and resistance. The military, always watching, saw the international group and came out in force. And the saddest part of this photograph for me is the farmer in that picture in the left side of your screen. The farmer who is just standing there with his arms crossed, watching. He has no recourse. Occupying a territory requires systems of control. I was fortunate to visit Israel, Palestine in the 90s before the wall was built. Returning this ugly wall built on the land appropriated from Palestinian land, it really hurt my heart. It separates Palestinians from their land, their neighbors, their communities, and is a system of misery in so many ways. Many call it a separation wall. Others, as our denomination included, call it an apartheid wall. And both are true. Controlling the movement of occupied people and limiting necessary resources is a crucial piece of an apartheid system. The system of checkpoints is really, it's hard to grasp for occasional visitors. These checkpoints seem to be everywhere, one moment open, another moment closed, restricting travel for Palestinians. On our way back from Nablus to Ramallah, we were stopped at a checkpoint for 3 hours. During that time, an ambulance was turned away, and you can see a picture of our waiting there, the lights of the car in the middle section of this screen. When we were finally allowed to pass, we discovered that there was no security issues. Settlers wanted to use the road for some event, and they didn't want to share it with Palestinians. Some checkpoints are closed to Palestinians from 5:30 to 10 o'clock every morning so that settlers can use the roads to get to work. Imagine what that means for people trying to get to work or trying to get to school. For Palestinians, many of the checkpoints cannot be traversed by car, only on foot. This requires hours of standing in line. One can always identify a Palestinian village by the black water barrels on the top of the houses. As Rick said, water is often siphoned from Palestinian land and sold back to Palestinians. Palestinians cannot build wells, and the water is restricted along with electricity. So catching rainwater is a matter of survival. Another aspect of occupation is the instilling of fear. There are regular police incursions into neighborhoods in the middle of the night or early morning hours, arresting young people, some as young as 12 years old, without due process, and sometimes sending them back into the neighborhood as informants. It is the attempt to create mistrust and fear among neighbors. Like a flower that appears in the crack of a city sidewalk, all around us we witness signs of hope, signs of courage, signs of faith and resistance. And so let me mention a few. One afternoon we visited with Dr. Massim Quinzia, a professor at Bethlehem University, to learn about his work in biodiversity. I think that's Quinzia. He emphasizes native biology that honors the intentions of the land. In contrast, many of the settlements have greened the areas in ways that are destructive, wasting precious water resources. When the state of Israel was formed by depopulating more than 450 to 500 Palestinian villages, they covered up the villages with fast-growing pine trees donated by many in this country and around the world, creating beautiful public parks. However, pine trees are not native to the Middle East, and so they're vulnerable to forest fires. Many forest fires are uncovering the sins of the past as they reveal the ruins of those Palestinian villages. I find hope in the Tent of Nations. You will see it in the middle picture. The Tent of Nations is a farm in the hills outside of Bethlehem that welcomes visitors from the international community to come and work the land with them. The Nasser family has owned the land for over 100 years. It has a deed that proves it, but for 30 years they've been in court because the government covets the land. The Tent of Nations is not given permits to build on the land, so they live in caves as their ancestors did. They're not allowed water or electricity, so they depend upon solar and rainwater. The government has blocked access to the property and plans for the apartheid wall to separate them from their Bethlehem community. Settlers regularly climb fences onto the land to destroy crops and threaten lives. At a recent meeting in Washington, D.C., we talked with Daoud Nasser, who told us of being held at gunpoint just a few weeks before by settlers. It was only the presence of a Belgian visitor that saved his life. Strong Lutherans, the motto of the Tent of Nations is "We refuse to be enemies." The priest by the well is Father Justinus, who is 84. He's still the caretaker and guardian at the Greek Orthodox Church at Jacob's Well. He came to the church 40 years ago after the previous priest was killed by settlers. No one else dared come, even the nuns left. He has been attacked numerous times by settlers. During his years there alone, he has filled the church with magnificent icons, which he has painted. We were the first group, international group, he has seen since October the 7th. Now, why is he a sign of hope? He reminds me of all of the brave and faithful Christian leaders who are keeping the lights on, so to speak, on behalf of Christians everywhere. I can't mention signs of hope without naming the young people in the West Bank who are trying to carve a future out of the pain of the present. Watch the video of these young people at a community center in the Ida refugee camp. Wish we had the music to go along with that. In Nablus, we met the Seeds for Development and Culture, SEEDS for short, which is a youth-led NGO dedicated to the empowerment of Palestinian youth. Their vision is one of a Palestinian society led by youth and characterized by freedom, equality, democracy, and human dignity. These young people are not living with blinders. Their lives are devastatingly difficult, but they are choosing to live into hope and possibility. Rick and I had the opportunity to spend an evening in the home of Fersan Zumant, his lovely wife and mother-in-law and precious children. I think we have a picture of them. On another evening, we shared a meal with Amir Barham and her sister Marina. Now, I will be honest, life is difficult for both families. Rick and I have felt compelled to provide financial support for their work. It is a struggle, And it is for them that we continue to march, to pray, to financially support our Christian siblings in their struggle for freedom and justice. We look forward to welcoming another Palestinian peacemaker, Zugbi, to our presbytery in September. Well, what I would like to do now is to turn this to Hunter to interpret the history and our recent experience in the context of our mission calling, which has always been an important focus for Presbyterian women.
Thank you, Mary Jean, and thank you, Rick, that you helped us to step into a very deep and complex context with a little more understanding. And now I'd like to invite us to push back from the table a little bit, to put on hats as Presbyterian women and people who support mission through the Presbyterian Church, and to think a little more broadly, if we could. Because I think in my own experience, I've learned two things from Presbyterian women. The first is that Presbyterian mission has historically been led by women. It is Presbyterian women who started the first missionary societies, who have cajoled, have funded the denomination and pushed it to get involved in mission in a variety of ways. Across 200 years of mission history, we've sent out more women than men as missionaries. And Presbyterian women, you can calculate it, have given more, prayed more, and volunteered more hours than any other group in the church, bar none. Long before women could be ordained as ministers or elders in the United States, in our church, women missionaries were preaching, baptizing, and officiating the Lord's Supper in places around the world. And long before women physicians could establish their own medical practice in the States, women missionaries were treating patients, performing surgery, diagnosing illness, and training doctors and nurses across much of what we now call the majority world. I think Presbyterian women have helped me see that the greatest protagonists of Presbyterian mission history have in fact been women. Second lesson that I've learned from you Presbyterian women is this: throughout our history, Presbyterian women have understood that mission without justice is not God's mission. We think about Maria Fearing, for example, who as a 56-year-old applied for mission service. She had recently been freed from slavery and traveled as a Presbyterian missionary to what was then called the Congo Free State, now the DR Congo. When she saw the oppressive policies of Belgian King Leopold that called for the cutting off of the hands of Congolese villagers who didn't produce their monthly quota of rubber, Maria Fearing persuaded the Presbyterian mission, including William Shepherd and William Morrison, to begin to advocate publicly for justice. And the effort resulted in eventually wresting the Congo from King Leopold II's control. I think of the situation of Presbyterian women when I think about Pearl S. Buck and many female Presbyterian missionaries who were in China, and they wrote home of the horrendous conditions of Chinese women who were being drawn into trans-Pacific human trafficking. PW responded by funding development work in China to help women there to prevent the tragedy and to develop institutions in San Francisco and on the West Coast to receive and advocate for Chinese women who would arrive penniless in the United States without any rights. This marriage of justice and mission has been a hallmark of Presbyterian women since its founding. I think of a more recent example that some in this group saw firsthand. I see several folks from the Broad Street Presbyterian Church in Columbus. I remember when public health researchers discovered that 97% of the children in La Oroya, Peru had lead poisoning. And this photo, it was taken by Bruce Wilson, a member of Broad Street Presbyterian. It was in fact the women of Giddings Lovejoy Presbytery in St. Louis and Columbus's Broad Street Presbyterian Church here in this presbytery, who would simply not stop advocating for the children and their families and calling out for justice. The corrupt U.S. company that was polluting La Oroya was forced to leave, and just last month, the Inter-American Court for Human Rights ruled in favor of the families of La Oroya, awarding them millions of dollars in medical care and in damages. Because Presbyterian women have always understood that mission without justice isn't mission at all. I'd like us to think a little bit about what we've heard today. Sometimes the numbers, the statistics boggle our imagination. We can't even get our heads around the level of human suffering. The fact that since October 7th, quickly approaching 35,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza by the bombing. Now, in my 37 years of work with the Presbyterian Mission, I have never seen a situation as desperate as the current situation in Gaza, the West Bank, and Jerusalem. This genocide of the Palestinian people is happening even as we're meeting this evening. And the tragedy for me is that your and my tax dollars are paying for the bombs that are being used to drop on the tent cities of Rafah in southern Gaza, even tonight. As of tonight, almost 35,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, and there is a direct line between this one-sided war of ethnic cleansing and your and my complicity. And so the question comes to us in the words of the disciples who respond to this gospel of Jesus Christ, who see this countercultural example, this man who stood in behalf of the suffering and the oppressed, who stood with women who had no voice in society. The disciples proclaim, "How then must we live?" They're flabbergasted. What's our response to this tragedy? Well, there are some things that we can do, and I'd like to lift these up for you. And this presentation will be available to you all afterwards if you'd like to either take notes now or follow along at your leisure later. The first calling is clearly to pray, and we heard from Christians across the West Bank who asked us to pray for peace, to pray for a release of the hostages and the more than 60,000 detained Palestinians, that is, people who are under administrative detention, many of them as children as young as 12 to 16 years old, who have not been informed of the charges against them, cannot meet with a lawyer, and have no idea how long they will be in prison. So the tragedy of the hostages is real, and we don't want to take away from that in any way. But the unpublicized hostage situation is that of these administrative detainees. We are praying, many of us, for an end to U.S. complicity with the carnage in Gaza and the West Bank. Praying has been a center point for Presbyterian women in their approach to mission throughout history. A second is advocacy. And again, Presbyterian women have never shied away from seeing the call to do God's justice in places around the world, as well as here at home. And so this past Lent period, I developed a Lenten practice of every morning, would get up, do some time in prayer, and then just take 20 minutes to go onto 3 websites, the whitehouse.gov. I would go on to my 2 senators from Pennsylvania. We in Pennsylvania and you in Ohio live in swing states. And that therefore our senators and our president are listening to us, maybe a little bit more than some of the red or blue states out there. For that reason, it becomes really important for us to get on those websites and to write our legislators from the president on down to advocate for an immediate ceasefire, to stop U.S. military aid to Israel, and to stop these land seizures, because every Palestinian home, every acre of farmland that is confiscated from Palestinian families makes the prospect of peace even more remote. These are critical issues that I think we need to attend to together, friends. These are coming to us straight from Palestinian Christians. The unity of what they're asking for, both in prayer requests and in advocacy, was remarkable to me. Finally, we'd invite you to give, and to give generously at this time, to feed people, not only their bodies, but also their spirits. And so we propose 2 organizations here, the Al-Rawad Cultural and Arts Center in Bethlehem, where that musicless, my apologies for the lack of music in the video clip that we showed you, showing those young people learning traditional Palestinian art and dance. In the oppressive context of the Aida refugee camp near Bethlehem, the Al-Rawad Society works to restore pride in Palestinian culture and art among young people and to engage them in a life of service. We would encourage you to give to this, and Martha will share with us the exact information in just a bit. And finally, the United Nations Relief and Work Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA, as it's called in short, is the UN organization that has been doing the most to feed the most Gazans throughout this time. They've been hampered by the pulling out of the United States and the US government's pressure on other governments to pull their funding from UNRWA. And this becomes an extremely critical time because UNRWA continues to feed more hungry women, children, and men in Gaza than any other organization. Let's all recognize that it's sometimes uncomfortable for us to talk together about controversial issues. We Presbyterians have a long history of being middle of the roaders. We like that more comfortable space in the center of the road so we don't veer to the left or the right. But in fact, we're called by our faith to engage in a little good trouble. That is to stand for justice with people who are being oppressed. We recognize with Gustavo Gutierrez that God loves all people, but is particularly sensitive to the place of those whose backs are against the wall, who are forced to the edges of society. For that reason, I think Mary Jean and Rick and I, as we went on this trip, it was not an even-handed trip. We did not speak with as many Israeli Jews as we did with Palestinian Christians or Palestinian Muslims. It was not that. It was to hear from the voices of Palestinian partners. Most of them were Christian organizations, and so we listened to them with particular care. This has been the experience that we had together for a jam-packed 10 days in February that we wanted to share with you. And we wanted to open up this time to questions. And we're open to do that, Martha, with you moderating that, or as people want to lift up questions, we can do that any way you want. Thanks so much for your attention. We know this is a lot to swallow. And therefore, we pray that you not swallow it, but that you sit with it, you hold on to it, and you pray through it in the coming days and nights. Because I tell you, I can't get some of these scenes and some of the people out of my mind. So we thank you for your courage to even think about this with us. We know that it takes a lot to think about it, but it takes a lot more to experience it by the people in West Bank, Gaza, and the Golan Heights. So we lift this up to you and are open to your questions and your comments and your engagement. Thanks.
Hunter, can I add one other thing that we heard as we traveled? And again, this truly hurt my heart, is we heard from our Christian partners that the church in the U.S. was not a reliable partner. And I had to come home and really sit with that, because I know there's a lot of truth in that. And so how can we become reliable partners with our Christian siblings in Palestine?
You know, as I sat and listened, I just have to be honest. You know, actually what's happening there happened right here in America with the Indians and we folks of color. And this is, to feel so bad about it and all of this now. Hey, we've been living that in America for years. And, back before 1938, my year of birth. But anyway, that's what I see. And, and I appreciate the concern, but we should have been doing that, Christians and all, right here in America. And we need to work on that also. So, I think it was interesting. And, and to bring it back and maybe more, but, it's happening here and all of you know that. You know that. That's it.
Yeah, I want to acknowledge that I didn't get into that in the historical part, but absolutely doctrine of discovery and settler colonialism, I would argue, is our history as well. I don't see any way around it. I can only say that I'm glad that our denomination and other denominations are beginning to own up to that. I'm pleased that in the last General Assembly, our denomination established a center for I'm going to get the name a little wrong, but something the Center for the Repair of Historic Harms. They didn't use the word reparations. because it's more than that. And so I'm glad that that we're beginning to take those very small steps. But you're absolutely right. We cannot ignore or deny the reality of what you said.
I appreciate that, Ms. Joyce. And I'm thinking also, as we've taken students to from Pittsburgh Seminary to Israel Palestine, we've taken 2 groups of students, and it always detonates the unspoken racial tension that follows in a seminary group when you have black and white students traveling together. And there's always comes a moment in that trip where a white student will be just amazed and say, I just can't believe the level of inhumanity. And a black student will say, have you ever seen something like this any other time in your life? And the white student, it sometimes responds, no, not at all. And it opens up, and we've had a couple of times when black students have stood up and walked out of the room because the pain is so unbearable. But it forces a beginning of the conversation that in our theology classes, we haven't been able to get to. So we are grateful to the ways that Palestinians have opened up to us a mirror so that we can see ourselves with new eyes. So thank you for bringing this up, because we need to, you got to start with yourself. And as Dr. King said, justice anywhere is just injustice everywhere. So I appreciate that word. What other questions?
What other questions does anybody have? What do you want to hear more about?
Martha, this is Les. I don't have a question so much as a comment. First of all, I appreciate what you and the Presbyterian women are doing to lift this concern up at this time to us. It's not like our denomination hasn't been focused on these concerns over time. We could go into a whole presentation on the General Assembly resolutions, that have been adopted around these very concerns over the years, and documents that have been produced and studies that have been done. I mentioned in the chat one that PW itself did back in 209, 210 on the Middle East. But what I've learned, if anything, is that we have to keep raising up these issues over and over and over in various settings. And to pass a GA resolution doesn't do it. We keep making the same mistakes over and over, and we need to keep relearning and recommitting to investment and involvement or justice. There is, I know, a group in existence in the denomination called the Middle East Network, and it's church people across the denomination that continue to engage in these concerns. And so that's one resource, I guess, that we could involve ourselves with or become more informed of. But the kind of thing that Mary Jane and Rick are doing to go and then bring back reports like this are just invaluable, and to encourage and bring to us the kind of representatives that will again be coming in the fall. We need to do what we can to open up our doors and our hearts to the stories that they bring to us and the suggestions they have for how we can be helpful. I guess that's all I wanted to share.
This is Louise Davidson. I'm curious. I had an experience in 2000, church-wide gathering. They had a global exchange to the Middle East in 1999, and they brought back women from the Middle East to participate in the gathering. One of the women was a Jewish woman, which was extraordinary. And she had been part of an organization called Women in Black. And they had been instrumental in standing in front of olive trees, in front of buildings, at places where they were tearing up the roads in Palestine. And I wondered, is there still any Jewish organization that is doing this kind of thing?
Jewish Voices for Peace is one, or there are many organizations. One that has been very active is Jewish Voices for Peace. The Columbus has a very active chapter of that. And but there are a number of Jewish organizations that do not agree with what's going on with the Netanyahu government. And Beth Shalem, is it Beth Shalem? Is
B'Tselem,
Salim.
B''Tselem. I'll put it in the chat.
Well, it is also an organization. There's an organization, Military Watch, and we didn't speak with them on this last trip, but we did in 22. And it's a group of Jewish lawyers who are working to document what's happening to young Palestinians in prison. And so there are, there are probably 100 Jewish organizations who are working diligently and faithfully.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to hear that.
Louise, I just add, I'm seeing here in the Pittsburgh area, the two fastest growing groups among folks who are hitting the streets, who are out calling for justice, are Jewish young people and African-American young people. And we see just a massive explosion in terms of who's coming out and showing up. I was at a county council meeting here, Allegheny Council, which is the county of Pittsburgh. And I think there were 160 of us who showed up to speak to the ceasefire resolution that came before our county about a month ago. It was right after the trip when we got back. And I had gone, they limited our time to 1 minute, but of the people who spoke, and 120 people spoke. Of the people who spoke, a third of them self-identified as Jewish, and about 80% of them were under the age of 25. And I was just blown away. But this is a shift that's happening. And a number of my Jewish friends from college days speak of the tension within their own household as younger folks have a very different view on this conflict than their parents do. It's causing a lot of tension. So just kind of approaching this all with in a sense of prayer and sympathy, but realizing the tide is shifting very quickly in this.
I'm glad to hear that. I lived in Allegheny County in Pittsburgh for 17 years, so I know where you are.
Other comments, questions? What stirred you in this? What surprised you? What are you going to do with this? We'd be curious to think about this with you.
This is Patty Nussel from Broad Street. Thank you for all of this. You know, what I'm going to do with all of this, when I go to dinner with friends, including Jewish friends, long-term, help me verbalize how these facts and our love for Palestinians and Jews is not a hate for Jews, because that seems to be an underlying presumption. And it's sometimes hard to overcome among us older, white, traditional people. And I don't have a good way to express that short of a 90-minute PW Zoom call, which was great. Thanks all.
Let me just say that if I might respond to that, that for a number of years, the Presbyterian Church did not speak out. And we didn't speak out because we were scared of being considered anti-Semitic. And I think that we cannot be frightened by that anymore. To be clear that we are not anti-Semitic. We are anti-genocide. We are anti what's going on with the Netanyahu government. We are anti what the policies of the state of Israel. And we need to just make that clear. You know, we talk about our past in this nation, and we have a lot to confess, that we need to confess. Israel, as it came into the land, has a lot that it needs to confess as well. There were genocides in 1948. There were villages that were massacred. And, you know, and so as we look at October the 7th, and it was horrible, but it did not begin October the 7th. And so I think that as we talk with our Jewish friends, and we need to be compassionate in terms of the fear that they feel, that generational fear, that generational trauma. Palestinians carry that same generational trauma with them as well.
I think another thing, you know, there's a long tradition of protest in the United States, civil rights movement, anti-war movements. We can go on and on. Doesn't mean that we're anti-US to criticize people who embrace policies that are that we think are mistaken and we think are unjust. So I think that's one thing that you can keep in mind. Another thing is, you know, I don't think anybody who went on our trip in February would call for the end of the state of Israel. It's not that Israel shouldn't exist. I mean that if anybody ever thought that ship has sailed. It's there to say. But nobody would deny the horror. Nobody except certain people would deny the horrors of World War II and all the pogroms that happened before. But that can't be used as a justification for injustice and occupation and ethnic cleansing. And you know, it may be that there's some people who just aren't able to hear that.
What is the relationship between the Palestinian people and Hamas? Anyone?
Here's my analogy, Bill Kelly, because I'm a Cleveland girl. You know, the mob is in Cleveland. It just is. It's there. It's underneath everything. You didn't vote them in. You don't want them there. But you go about your daily life. You know, things happen. And, you know, I say to people, it's like they walled in the city of Cleveland, you know, and said, we're going to kill everyone in the mob. Well, I'm not the mob. I'm just trying to like have my bakery on top, you know, and I'm stuck inside, and the sea is my only outlet. That's my 2 cents analogy for my Ohio connection to what I think it's like to live with a power structure that's not an elected government and not an independent nation. But I welcome other thoughts.
Well, one of the things that we heard while we were there, no one that we talked with had any appreciation for the violent tactics used by Hamas. Hamas is a political party. It's done some good things in the past. And I think that, you know, I compare it to when we went into Iraq. And I was, many in this country were opposed to that. But when your country is in the middle of war, you don't turn against your country many times. I think there are folks who don't appreciate, don't support what Hamas, the violent part of what Hamas does, but what Israel is doing is pushing them right into the arms of Hamas. We spoke with people in Jordan when we were in Jordan for a little while before the trip and afterwards who support Hamas because of what Israel is doing. Now, Hunter, you may have spoken with other people and heard other views.
No, just to say, I think it's the violent tactics of Hamas that have alienated from many Palestinians. But even so, there are not many alternatives. And so Gazans did vote Hamas in. So there is a little more than what Patty's saying. There was an electability feature there. But at the same time, both the US and Israel, we have a level of responsibility because we helped fund Hamas. We wanted to, Israel, and we were supporting their policy. Israel was building up Hamas to divide, to weaken the Palestinian organization, the Palestinian organization. So I think there's a complex history there. But I think the vast majority of the people of Gaza have nothing to do with Hamas, and for this level of warfare and the destruction of houses and apartment buildings and hospitals and universities, the total annihilation of this area of a very densely populated area. Pushes this way past this pushes it into what numerous authorities are calling war crimes. And so, I mean, we're at a different level here. And I agree. And I'm in a long ongoing conversation with two close friends of mine who are Jewish, and it's a very painful conversation. And I don't know that we're going to find much agreement together, but we're committed to continue in this conversation. And this is one of the most painful points is the continued existence of Hamas, because I think many, at least my conversations with American Jewish friends, they believe as long as Hamas exists, it is a violent threat to the people of Israel and to Jews worldwide. So, and there are some, and the longer this conflict goes, the more true that will become. So it's a frightening situation. And that's why I feel like it's so important for a ceasefire to be implemented as soon as possible. You got to separate the folks who are getting beaten so that we can begin to reflect in a new way. Yeah. Someone had asked a little earlier as we were getting started about ways to continue. And I just wanted to mention the organization that helped gather us together in this country. Part of the PCUSA is the Israel-Palestine Mission Network. In my history, working with the denomination, the IPMN, or Israel-Palestine Mission Network, is one of the best organized and most effective mission networks that we have in the denomination. And we've got a lot of good ones, but this is one of them. I put in the chat their website, and they have some very helpful, not only educational resources, but also steps for advocacy, things that we can do that we've been asked to do by Christian and Muslim partners in Israel and Palestine. So I just wanted to put that up. Thanks.
I would throw out just one more comment in response to you, Bill. I think Mary Jean and Hunter and I and all the folks on the trip, our primary concern is the Palestinian people and Palestinians. It's a very complex situation all the way around. Although people keep telling us that as an excuse to not have a ceasefire. And I say, well, no, there's nothing complex about genocide, but the overall situation in Israel-Palestine has a lot of dimensions. Palestinians will tell you that they're not really crazy about the Palestinian leadership. They will talk about how difficult. In fact, we spent about 3 hours with a fellow named Sam Bahour, who is a Palestinian American who grew up in Youngstown. He lives in Ramallah now, and he kind of took he took the Israeli government apart. He took the Palestinian Authority apart. He took other Arab nations apart for just the unwillingness to come to grips with things over the course of decades. So it's the Palestinian people's relationship to Hamas is as I think Hunter and Mary Jean described it. But it's also the case, as they indicated, that the more Israel does, the more people turn to Hamas in many cases. That was kind of rambling. I'm sorry about that.
No, and you know, it seems the bottom line for me is we need to continue to work to understand, to read, to understand these issues. But the bottom line is tonight in Rafah, the tanks have gone in and people are being killed. I think there are 1.2 million people in the Rafah area.
I think that's right.
And the humanitarian avenues, the avenues for humanitarian aid have been cut off. People are in dire need tonight, and that military equipment killing the people has our name on it, our tax dollars. And tonight in prayer, you know, may we all sit with that and think about ways that we can become reliable partners. I want to say tonight that many of you know that last November, Rick and I were leading a trip to the area sponsored by the Presbytery. That trip, November of last year, of course, was called off, and we didn't know whether we would reschedule that. And our trip in February convinced us that we need to take a group to come and see and then go and tell. And we will go on November the 6th through the 19th. As I said, it's sponsored by the Soda Valley Presbytery Commission on Justice, Outreach, and Education. If you have someone in your congregation who you would like to send, please have them get in touch with us. Many congregations have peacemaking funds that have kind of added up over the years, and they've not used that money. And this would be a wonderful way to use that. Or if you want to support someone else in going, to go and see so that we can come back or come and see and go and tell is what our Palestinian friends ask us to do.
Is there anybody with a final question before we close things up here?
Hey, Martha, just you know, I was going to type this in, but currently, this is like thinking at statewide, there is a bill that's being heard tomorrow, and I can't go to the Department of Education, or it's an education bill. And, you know, thinking about diversity and inclusion, they want to remove that from primary, secondary, and colleges across the board. So part of, you know, learning the history and mistakes in public health was very important in my curriculum, you know, and how to treat people in the public health setting. That type of aspect is on the table to be removed. Learning about how Black and brown folks were treated, again, removed. And like I said, that is the first hearing and in the education department or education committee, I don't know the number of the bill. I don't know if it's a House bill or a Senate bill, but I know it's something that's being heard. The first hearing is happening because OSU's president is going to that hearing. And how he responded to the demonstrations on OSU, he's going to be asked about. So I'm just saying that, learning our history and sitting with our history, the good, bad, and the ugly, makes us a better person. Our sermon last week with Ann Palmerton was about fruits of the Spirit, and I think that diversity, inclusion, and learning about our past mistakes and how we can be better all falls under the fruits of the Spirit, and how we treat each other. So removing that kind of education from kids, or even in the college area where it's good to have, that's where a lot of the hard work happens. I think that's terrible. I think that's a terrible thing that someone would do that in Ohio. So that's something we could do in Ohio.
Yeah, thanks for that. And thanks for connecting the dots, because I think that's a really important point. Thanks for that, Beth. I saw, I think, Lynn Kuhn's hand up.
Yes, I was privileged to go to Israel with Trinity Lutheran Seminary sometime in the last 10 years. I can't remember anymore. And I saw the settlements, and I saw the blockades, and it all broke my heart then. And of course, we met with Sabeel, and our guide was a Muslim, Palestinian, who had a home in Jerusalem, to which his wife, because she wasn't on the lease or wasn't an owner, couldn't come to the house in Jerusalem. The rules and regulations, the laws were so merciless. When I got back to Columbus, somebody had made a movie called Two Blue Lines, and I struggled for a long time to try. I prayed that finally we'd have two separate states, but there is no way, seeing the map now, that can ever happen. And we heard years ago, Blood Brothers at PW Churchwide Gathering, what's his name?
Elias Shakur.
Right. He spelled it out then for us that the Palestinian Christians have been there since the Jews went into diaspora. And the olive trees, I've been buying olive oil from Israel because of PW, and they can't get any, but not from Israel, from Palestine. But they can't get it anymore because Palestine is in ruins. But I have a dear Jewish friend, and she's as upset about all of this as all of us are. Mm-hmm. It's devastating to her. She knows how wrong Israel is. I don't know how to find peace in all of this, though. I can't find it anywhere. And the right doesn't seem to be coming through. So we pray. But I saw how hard it was in the last 10 years, and things have only gotten worse. And then we were seeing villages that had been bombed where the kids weren't safe in their own streets because the Israeli army would come in and pluck the kids out. It was just awful.
Lynn, let me, it has been difficult since being back in, since February, but I saw a quote online that I have by my computer that has been really helpful to me. Adrienne Rich. She says, "My heart is moved by all I cannot save. So much has been destroyed. I have to cast my lot with those who age to age, perversely, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world." I love that quote, and it reminds me that those of us with no extraordinary power have an opportunity every day to get up and just do acts that reconstitute the world, however small. That's what God calls us to each day.
Thank you again, Hunter, Rick, and Mary Jean. Our hearts are heavy and our minds inundated with all that you shared this evening. God bless your ministries. And thank you, one and all, for attending this special PW gathering. Let us close with prayer. God of peace and justice, we have listened intently tonight, and we turn our hearts toward you for answers. Give us courage to share the stories we heard tonight so that peace can find a way to happen. Let there be peace, and let it begin with us tonight. And when we have opportunities to support our Palestinian siblings through financial donations or in other ways, let us step up and do so with glad hearts. In Christ's service and name, amen.